When Apple Silicon came to the Mac in 2020, it was seen as a revolution, not just for the Mac, but for the MacBook Air, which for the first time finally had amazing performance to match its amazing design. Really, the M1 chip made that MacBook Air into something that's kind of iconic. But there was another thin and light computer that also received the M1 chip shortly thereafter, and that of course is the iPad Pro. But the iPad Pro never received that same iconic status. And I would argue this iPad has held up just as well as the M1 MacBook Air. So in this video, I want to revisit the M1 iPad Pro and talk about how it's held up, how the software has drastically improved since it came out, and figure out if this is still a viable option for someone who wants a high-end iPad in 2026. To really understand what makes the M1 iPad Pro so special, we have to go back and get some context. When Apple Silicon was announced, it was announced as a family of SoCs designed specifically for the Mac. So it was a little bit surprising when Apple announced that the M1 chip would be put in the iPad Pro as well. And as I think about it, this is probably where that whole narrative of the software not taking advantage of the hardware on iPad really kind of took off. Reviewers couldn't understand why Apple would put such a powerful chip in an iPad and have nothing to take advantage of it, my favorite phrase. The thing is, that M1 chip that was so groundbreaking on the Mac was kind of old news on the iPad Pro. You see, Apple had already been developing powerful ARM-based chips for the iPad Pro for years. It started with the original iPad Pro in 2015 that had the A9X and continued with the A10X, A12X, and A12Z. In my mind, if you thought of the M1 as the A14X, I don't think you'd be too inaccurate. So even though the M1 didn't quite have the same groundbreaking effect on the iPad Pro, this iPad still came with a number of firsts for iPad and Mac as well in some cases. This was the first iPad that had the center stage feature where the camera could kind of follow you around in frame as you moved. The 12.9-inch Pro was the first Apple computer to have a mini LED backlit display, which is common in all the MacBook Pros today. And of course, this was the first iPad to have a Thunderbolt port, making it so you could connect to docks with multiple accessories and really improve your productivity, especially if you're working at a desk. And these are all things that iPad Pro users take for granted today, but really they started here with this M1 iPad Pro. So I ended up getting the Wi-Fi only 12.9-inch model with 512 gigabytes of storage and 8 gigabytes of RAM. The body of the tablet itself is actually in really good shape. I went with the silver model, so a lot of the more surface scratches and stuff don't stand out as much. I have a few nicks towards the bottom, you'll notice, but overall, I would say this has held up pretty well. Small disclaimer, I actually picked this up in late 2022, so I haven't had this the full 5 years it's been out, so keep that in mind. This design was essentially unchanged from the legendary 2018 iPad Pro, except that for the 12.9-inch model, it got noticeably thicker and heavier. Now that used to be fine until the M4 iPad Pro came out with its much thinner and sleeker design, and coming back to this, it really stands out and makes this feel not quite as nice as it used to. This iPad lived most of its life with a screen protector on it, so the screen is pretty much immaculate. But there have been some issues. I've actually gone through 2 different Apple Care replacements on this iPad, both of them for a dark spot developing along the edge of the screen. I did a quick Google search on this, and there have been a few other people that have reported this issue, but not enough that I'm willing to say that it's widespread. Now let's go back to why this iPad was so much thicker and heavier, and that was of course to support that mini LED display. And I can tell you that it looks just as good today as it did back in 2022 when I picked this up. For most of the things you're going to do on this computer, you will be hard-pressed to tell the difference between the mini LED display and the OLED display on the M4 or M5 iPad Pro. Now this is the part of the video where I should probably start talking about the blooming issue that plagued this iPad when it came out. It's one of those things that it kind of depends on how you use your tablet. The effect is certainly there if you look for it in some videos and some games. For me and the way I use my iPad Pro, it's never bothered me. But overall, for day-to-day use, for email, for watching videos, for watching YouTube, this display still holds up great. And speaking of things holding up, when Apple announced this iPad Pro, they also announced a white version of their Magic Keyboard accessory. People always wonder how that one holds up. The answer for me has been mostly fine. Like when I just look at this day to day, looks new to me. When I put it under the camera, I can tell there is some maybe slight discoloration around the palm rest area, but it's not something that's bothered me. There are a couple of spots on this keyboard where the material is starting to come off, but hopefully it won't get much worse than that. From a performance perspective, the M1 iPad Pro has held up really well until iPadOS 26. iPadOS 26 was the first update where I started to notice some stuttering just in general navigation and use of this machine. Now, this update did add a lot of functionality on top of all of the liquid glass effects, so it's maybe not completely unreasonable that hardware this old is starting to struggle. But that's where iPadOS 27 makes things a little bit interesting. This release is full of bug fixes and performance improvements that, put together, so far make this device feel a bit more like it did on iPadOS 18 from a performance and responsiveness perspective. That means this computer is going to be useful and usable for that much longer. On 27, in day-to-day use, the experience on this tablet isn't too far off from the latest iPad Pros. When doing things again like web browsing, sending emails, working on documents, you'd be hard-pressed to see much of a difference. It's when we get to the more performance-intensive applications that the M1 starts to show its age. In Final Cut Pro, for example, the general editing experience is okay, but the app takes a lot longer to launch than on newer devices, and of course actually exporting your video takes significantly longer than a modern iPad Air or iPad Pro. This is exacerbated by the fact that, for whatever reason, Final Cut Pro on the M1 iPad Pro can't do background exporting. When it comes to gaming, I don't have a great benchmark here. I didn't do a ton of gaming when this was my primary machine. However, I did find a YouTube video from a YouTuber named Mr. MacRight who did an in-depth technical comparison on how some of the recent AAA console ports have performed on not only the latest iPad Pros, but the M1 iPad Pro. I'll put a link in the description. The entire video is worth a watch. Not to spoil it, but the consensus is kind of that if you want to be playing these AAA console ports and high-end games like that, the M1 iPad Pro isn't the best device for that today, unless you're willing to accept some visual compromise. Now, if your gaming needs are kind of more at that pixelated indie game level, I think there's still a lot of life in the M1 Pro for that. I think pretty much every review of the M1 iPad Pro complained about iPadOS and how the software was not taking advantage of the hardware. But all these years after this machine was released, it's kind of crazy to look back at how far it's come from a software perspective. This would have launched with iPadOS 14, so it's kind of crazy to look back at all the things you can do now that you couldn't when this launched. You can run more than 3 apps at a time. You can have apps in floating windows if you want. You can properly drive an external display. You can scale your display if you want to fit more content on your screen. You can plug in and use a USB camera. Apps can run background jobs now. They also have access to more memory thanks to features like virtual memory swap. Apple's Pro apps, Final Cut Pro and Logic Pro, are on the platform. In iPadOS 27, Siri can finally do more than set timers. And we finally have a calculator. Remember when that was the biggest problem we had? In all seriousness, I think we can absolutely say that the whole not taking advantage of the hardware thing no longer applies. That this machine performs so well after all these years is a testament not only to the hardware, but to the efficiency of iPadOS. Remember, this computer only has 8GB of RAM. On macOS, 8GB of RAM is a bit of a struggle. Look no further than the MacBook Neo. There are, of course, a few areas where the M1 chip is starting to fall behind. Probably not the device for high-end gaming if that's what you're into. Final Cut can struggle a little bit in some places on this machine, and of course there are some Apple Intelligence features that aren't supported on this hardware, like the more expressive Siri voices and improved dictation models. So for someone who is maybe looking to buy an iPad Pro, maybe you're coming from an older base iPad or iPad mini, is the M1 Pro something you should consider in 2026? The answer, as with many things in life, is it depends. So from my perspective, the M1 iPad Pro is a little bit too close to the bottom of the software compatibility list for me to feel comfortable wholeheartedly recommending this. My general advice at this point would be to be looking for a used or refurbished M4 iPad Pro to get that amazing design and that awesome display. However, if your needs are relatively modest, maybe they don't go much beyond web browsing and sending a few emails here and there, and you're okay with buying a machine that's probably going to stop getting OS updates in the next couple of years, then Absolutely, this is a great option. And at this point, I assume you should be able to find these secondhand at a pretty deep discount. What about the person who already has an M1 iPad Pro and has had one for a while? Are we finally reaching the time where you should consider upgrading? Ultimately, if you're happy with it, absolutely not. Ride this thing until it literally dies. There's only two reasons I would recommend you consider an upgrade if you have an M1 iPad Pro. One would be if your needs are starting to outgrow the hardware. So if you didn't buy enough storage, or you didn't buy enough RAM, or you're finding that intensive tasks like video editing or 3D modeling with something like ZBrush are starting to get really slow on your machine, it's a reason to consider an upgrade. The other reason would be battery life, especially if you're someone who's had this machine from day one. At this point, an original model is probably not holding a charge very well, and unfortunately, it's often the case that the cost of a battery replacement is just as much or more than buying a new iPad. So it's fair to say that the M1 iPad Pro never reached that same iconic status that the M1 MacBook Air still has today. But that doesn't mean that this isn't still a great and important iPad. And in my mind, it's pretty close in my ranking to the 2018 iPad Pro. 5 years after its release, it still holds up incredibly well, and I expect it to do so for many more years to come. That's going to do it for this one. As always, if you made it to the end, thank you. I appreciate you and your time. If you could like the video and subscribe to the channel, that helps me and the channel out a bunch. And with that, I will catch you in the next one. Thanks, and take care.